Joe Little is an Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Florida College of Law. He has taught there since 1967. Local government law and Florida constitutional law have been subjects of special interest to him. He has been active in local and state government matters and often represents clients in public interest lawsuits. Welcome, Commissioner Little.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I was kind of jokingly, not jokingly, describing you as the de facto Charter Commission historian on our Charter Commission, and your experience is remarkable. I think it might be helpful if you kind of explain to the citizens, why do we have charter counties? How did that evolve?
Well, thank you. First of all, let me indicate to you that although it is, I think, in a colloquial way, proper to say that a charter is a constitution of the county, in fact, that technically is not correct. The Constitution of our county is the Constitution of the state of Florida. And that leads me to this point. A county in Florida, and I think in most states, is a political subdivision of the state. It's an entity that is created to provide for the application of state laws at the local level. And there's a real distinction between a county and a municipality. A municipality is a special creation in the nature of a corporation, truly, for the benefit of a local area, for them to provide services and whatnot to themselves. Now, initially, county governments in Florida and elsewhere had limited functions, and they were primarily to support the courts and to provide a sheriff and other officers for law enforcement, primarily in the unincorporated areas, that is, the areas outside of municipalities. And that was true in Florida through most of our history, which goes back to 1845, when Florida actually became a state. Up through 1968, in Florida, counties had only those powers that were specifically provided to them by the legislature. And that meant that if a county like Alachua County wanted to do something different or something new, it had to go to Tallahassee, get the legislature, to enact what is called a special act, an act pertaining only to Alachua County.
And there were only 60 days a year where you had that opportunity.
That's
too.
right.
Yeah.
And back in earlier times, maybe only every 2 years.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So that meant that the county commissions and the people in the county were always at the behest or at the leave of the legislature in what they could do locally. And this was fine when Florida was a little rural state.
Right.
And if you look at the population growth of Florida, I think in 1968 the population was what, maybe 3 or 4 million?
Right, and now I think we're number 3 in the United States.
Yeah, over 21 million,
Yeah.
you see.
Yeah.
And what happened, in addition to this limitation on what counties could do, was that municipalities in Florida found it very hard to increase their boundaries. And we began to have population growth in Florida, and given the tax structure as it was then, and to some extent even now, it was advantageous economically for developers and others to develop outside of the cities instead of in municipalities, so that we had these rings of unincorporated urban growth that were outside municipalities. And the question began, who's going to provide public services to them?
Yeah, municipal services.
Municipal services
Right.
to them.
Right.
And the answer had to be, well, the only government they have is the county.
Right.
So we began to get into all kinds of conflicts between cities and counties that, for other reasons, have been fairly, to some extent, resolved now. But the question became, can we in fact have some home rule in Florida, both for municipalities and counties? Mm-hmm. And that was one of the big things in the 1968 Constitution. We had home rule provisions in Article 8, Section 1, which is the county article and section, and Article 8, Section 2, the municipal section. And in Article 8, Section 1G, I think it is, and again, the technicalities don't matter, all of a sudden we had a provision whereby counties could gain all the powers of local self-government, and those are the technical terms, local self-government, unless the legislature takes them away by general law or what's referred to as special law approved by the voters. So all of a sudden, counties could do locally, without any leave of the legislature, anything that is within the ambit of the notion of local self-government.
Which allowed for a flexibility, particularly in a state with the diversity of counties from the Panhandle to Southeast Florida. It allowed home rule, and I think that's where that phrase kind of came up, isn't it?
Yeah, the notion home rule has existed for a long time, but yeah, this was the implementation in Florida as to counties. And again, I want to emphasize that the legislature is still the big dog, yeah, because it has the power by general law to say that no county can do X, or all counties must do X, you see.
And every year, I also wear the hat of the Legislative Affairs Director, yeah, for the county, and every year is a back and forth between home rule and the erosion of, or from the state's perspective, the protection of the state's authority, and that's always an interesting conflict each year.
Well, it is, and I don't know to what extent the general public is aware of this, but in recent years the legislature has undertaken to exercise more control than it did in the past. When our '68 Constitution was first adopted, we had a very progressive legislature. Included in that '68 Constitution was a reapportionment of the state, so that we had a much fairer, I'll put it that way, mm-hmm, distribution of legislative seats throughout the state of Florida. And we had a lot of very progressive young lawmakers come in, especially from the southern counties. The old pork choppers were up here in the north. And we got all kinds of very good legislation, environmental legislation, land use legislation, and all kinds of things. And we had Governor Askew, as you may know, and Governor Graham. And things have changed since then in the legislature. It's much more, less progressive, I would say, let me put it that way. And a part of that less progression is the desire to limit what counties and cities can do in many areas. So that was the basis upon which the notion of a local charter at the county level came in 1968.
Commissioner Little, is there a threshold, or can any county decide they want to go through the process to become a charter county, or are there requirements that you have to meet somehow to be a charter county?
There are not. The essential factor is that one must have a charter put on the ballot, and that can be done through local initiation. It can be done by initiation through a special law in the legislature. So it's a political matter of getting the matter on the ballot. But the least populous county in our state, if it chooses, can adopt a charter. I might mention we have 67 counties in Florida, and at the moment, fewer than half of them have adopted charters. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the population of Florida, most of the population is located within charter counties.
Interesting.
But in terms of numbers of counties, most of them have not adopted charters.
As a kind of demonstration of the kind of political conflict is maybe not the right word, but the back and forth between home rule versus state. Things that come up to my mind are the recent plastic bag ordinance that the county and the city of Gainesville had to kind of back away from because of state preemptions. After the Parkland shooting, gun control was debated, vigorously at the state and the local level, and we discovered the very clear line of how far we could go with local legislation concerning gun control. We had a bit of a struggle a few years ago with wage theft, controlling that at the local level versus the state. So it's a flowing, constant back and forth, and if the state legislatures don't like what we're able to do now, they will certainly address that in the next legislative session.
That's true. And if we look at this political issue, of course, what we find is that, let me say, big vested interest that have economic power can concentrate themselves in Tallahassee, and that's what they'll choose to do, because otherwise they have to go to every county and every city in order to fight whatever fight they want to fight on these matters. Now, what can you do with the charter is a question that's important, and one that I think is the present Charter Review Commission is grappling with. From my point of view, in my study of the charter, I think there are two or three primary functions. Number one, you can reorganize county government. If you don't like 5 members of the county government, you can have 10. If you don't like the commission manager kind, which we have in Alachua County, and very successfully, it appears to me at the moment, one can decide, well, we want to have a separately elected legislative body, and we want to elect a county mayor who will be the chief executive officer.
And for those who don't know now, our charter is 5 commissioners that do the legislative work, and they only hire 2 people, the county manager and the county attorney.
Correct.
County manager acts as the CEO and hires the department directors and everyone else. I believe the commissioners have to ratify the department directors, but the manager makes those decisions.
Yes. And the people might decide, and I'm not suggesting this because I don't think it's a good idea, they might decide, well, we want to elect the county manager, you see, instead of having it appointed by the county commission. And indeed, in the past, we've had officers such as elected county attorneys. And again, I don't suggest that as a good idea, but the flexibility is there for changing the structure of the county government if the people should decide that they want to do so. I think when we're 250,000 people in Alachua County, more or less.
Yeah.
When you get to 1 million people, maybe then all of a sudden you need to think about whether some other form such as that.
Are 5 districts enough for that many people, that type of issue?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing you can do, the question about the relationship between county governments and municipal governments, such as the city of Gainesville, comes up. And there's some people that really want to do things to the city of Gainesville or cities in general. And the answer is that you can't do it, mostly you can't do it through the charter.
Right.
That's not, the county government does not become the superior of municipal government, with one exception. It is possible for a county charter to adopt a provision that permits a county regulatory ordinance to control a city regulatory ordinance.
Can you give an example of that?
I can, and you may remember, of course, we had a few years ago a conflict about whether we should have a cement plant in Alachua County. And at that time, the Alachua County environmental regulations were such that the operators of the cement plant couldn't make it work in the part of Alachua County, that is the unincorporated area, that is governed by the Alachua County. So it went to a municipality in our state, and in our county, and the municipality said, well, we have lesser environmental regulations, or we have, let me put it this way, we have regulations that will not preclude your being here.
And annexation.
And so there was annexation to the city, and of course the cement plant was built. After that, the people of Alachua County adopted a provision that stated when in fact a municipal ordinance and a county ordinance on environmental matters, speaking generally, are in conflict, then the county ordinance will apply.
And if I remember correctly, air and water quality were the primary kind of
I think that's correct.
Measurements on that. Yeah,
that's correct.
I know our charter has dealt with the environmental issue. We've dealt with, in the past, campaign finance.
That's right, and that was a question of working with state law.
Right.
The state, and maybe you'll remember, I think we actually had to get a special law to do that.
I remember there was a straw ballot, I think initially in 2020 perhaps, and we heard that there was interest in campaign finance, and then I think it was 2004 where the limitations like $250 donations came to play. But charter is a fascinating thing, and I'm glad you brought up the idea of the charter review process is not a process where you take care of small grievances or complaints.
Should not be.
That should not be. We don't control submissions,
right.
But it's a very important document. I'm glad you made the distinction between, people frequently call it our Constitution, and that is an important distinction. But it's not something that you hope would change lightly, or things that make it to the ballot are things. I like our process because we have 12 members this time, so it takes 7 to advance something to the ballot.
Yes.
I think it's a great provision that you all have independent legal counsel. Not to mention the legal counsel that we have on the commission itself.
Well, a legal voice.
Anyway. In your mind, is there a downside to the charter review process or being a charter county?
Yes, there is. I think that there is an impetus on a part of submitters that there's something that bothers me that is really not of charter significance, not even close to charter significance. And it's submitted in all earnestness to the commission, and most of the commission members are not as versed in the charter as you are and as I am.
Certainly not as you are.
And so we've got this very sincere person here, and we're empathetic to that person. And so we spend a lot of time maybe dealing with things that we shouldn't be dealing with. And some of those things occasionally do get on ballots. And regrettably, in my own opinion, it seems that nowadays, as opposed to my hunch about what it was in the past, the people who come to vote on a matter who don't know anything about it are more inclined to vote yes than no.
Right.
And that's a mistake.
So that's the danger.
That's the danger.
Something gets on, and someone who perhaps only comes out during presidential elections and hasn't really been immersed in local politics sees something that on its face
looks
seems
good.
Yeah.
Feels good.
Right.
And therefore I'm going to vote yes. And when you get all of these things in a charter, as in a constitution, we have the same problem with the Florida Constitution. It may be, other than cluttering the Constitution and taking away its, to some extent, its dignity as I look at it. I look at these legal documents such as constitutions as sort of precious writings, and you want to keep them as as clear and clean as you can. So,
Right.
apart from simply clogging them up with things that maybe oughtn't to be in them, maybe there's no real great downside to it.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the issue of counties being a subset of state government.
Political subdivision.
Political subdivision. Thank you. Keep my language straight. Because I think a lot of people are not clear on that relationship. And frequently, in my role as communications director, I hear from citizens constantly, of course. And I will hear someone say, your job is just to do this. Why aren't you doing this better? And whenever I have the opportunity, I take time to explain our job is not just this. Some of our job, much of our job, or our responsibilities are mandated by the state.
By the state.
There have been provisions to keep the state from putting too many unfunded mandates on us.
Right.
But, you know, things like social services, funding the court's facilities, the sheriff's facilities.
Very big functions.
Yeah, huge functions.
Right.
And folks would like to think, but if only you would put all your money into roads, our roads would be pristine. And, you know, it's important that we take time, and I'm glad we're doing it on this show, to explain it's a very complicated and varied group of responsibilities that counties have handed down to them from the state.
Absolutely. And things like the jail, for example, running the elections, even though you have an elected supervisor of the elections, the county has to support that.
That's right.
Financially.
Yeah.
And the sheriff, financially.
Yeah.
And the property appraiser, and the tax collector.
Yeah.
All of those things the county must support. And now counties, and again, this is a part of what happened in '67 primarily, counties, as we suggested earlier, also have to act like cities in terms of providing municipal services outside of the existing cities.
Yeah.
So it's a very complex.
You know,
role.
you're right. There are a lot of areas in this town, and when you get your mail, it says Gainesville on it.
Yes.
But sometimes people don't understand that, for example, Hale Plantation is unincorporated Alachua County. Town of Tioga.
And they
is,
get Gainesville addresses.
and they have Gainesville addresses.
Yes.
You know, we have an urban core that is not all the city of Gainesville. The county commission has actually been very supportive of orderly annexation.
Yes.
And-
Unlike 40 years ago.
yeah, and unlike many places in Florida right now.
Right now, right.
But yeah, it's a challenge, and you know, there's a natural conflict, I think, between counties and cities when it comes to annexations, because you lose some of the tax revenue. And the hope is that there's an orderly transition of services, but sometimes there's some friction there
Yes.
about who continues to apply what. Are roads that were county roads absorbed by the cities in annexations? So annexation is by no means a simple matter when it comes to...
No, it is not.
Yeah.
And I think I believe I'd pat both the city and the county commission on the back to think that they're doing a much more collaborative job than was done in the past.
Yeah. Well, Commissioner Little, I wish I had more time with you. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate the work that you and the other commissioners are doing on this year's charter review process. Thank you.
Thank you very much.